An extremely serious program, and extremely serious because it's about the possible impending attack on Iran and the consequences of such an attack. On September the 13th, the Jerusalem Post reported that the U.S. is to attack Iran in 8 to 10 months. And we need to talk about that, and who better to talk about it than one of the best informed and extraordinary people who ever comes on this program, none other than our resident prophet, John Hogue. Now, what is some dreamy prophet going to come up with? Well, not John Hogue's no dreamy prophet. We hold his feet to the fire every summer, and every January we have him prophesy for the coming year. And it is astonishing stuff. Partly it is because John is a very smart, very well-informed man. Partly because he is also a real prophet. And we know that because we've seen him hit year after year after year. Welcome to the show, John Hogue.
It's great to be back on, Whitley.
Well, it's always exciting to have you on, John. And today we're going to be talking about Iran with John Hogue. And John's website is HogueProphecy.com. There's a great free newsletter just like ours, and you will not get spammed if you join John Hogue's newsletter. It's a private newsletter just like ours. And so do go to HogueProphecy.com, subscribe to his email newsletter, and get involved in prophecy and political and social commentary. Okay, John, there is a new ebook up, I believe, called Nostradamus, The War with Iran. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where we are right now?
Yes, back in the spring, I was compelled to put together a lot of prophetic findings based on the 16th century prophet Nostradamus, and who has long spoken about the importance of Iran, the importance of a return of a Jewish nation into Palestine after a war that lasts 6 days, a 6-day war, and how these two, in combination with this strange riddle of a true serpent as a symbol for the invaders.
A true serpent, did you say?
Yeah, a true serpent, which is...
But I don't want to interrupt your flow, but we're going to need to know what that you believe that means, a true serpent.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say, that it is the key to, like many things with Nostradamus, is random codes. It's the key that unlocks a lot of his prophecies to give us an idea of whether they're about our times or near future times. The true serpent is involved with, perhaps the Israelis, with an attack on Persia, the ancient name of Iran. It is an invader that comes through Karmania's coast, which is the Strait of Hormuz. In the prophecies, he calls it Karmania by its old name. And the true serpent has been a riddle for 4 centuries that people have tried to figure out. And I've often stated in my books and radio that when you're close to an event being fulfilled, the riddles suddenly drop and they become quite clear. The true serpent is the U.S. Navy Jack. That is a flag that is 13 stripes, red and white stripes, with a uncoiled rattlesnake on it. And it's basically the original Navy Jack of the United States Navy during the American Revolution. That back on September 11th, 2002, on the first year anniversary of the 9/11 disaster, terrorist attack, George W. Bush, the President of the United States, had designated that all Navy ships fly that flag until the end of the war of terror is upon them. So this is a significant thing because that flag is not flown.
John, just hold on a second. Why would he ask them to fly that particular flag? What was his reasoning?
Well, I think it goes back, as many politicians are advised or think of themselves, the importance of allegory, the importance of symbols. This was a famous, anybody who knows anything about the American Revolution has seen this flag of the serpent, the rattlesnake, and it says, "Don't tread on me," underneath it. This is the first flag that Paul Revere and the American Navy flew. Sort of brings back a symbolism of going back to naval roots and patriotism. And what makes it significant in prophecy is that it's not a flag. If it had been hoisted on the masts of U.S. ships for centuries, it doesn't have a specific time window like it does being hoisted on the Navy ship, all Navy ships, since 2002, to signify a symbolic response of a force that's fighting in a modern war.
Now, there's something absolutely fascinating here, John. There's a mystery. Back in the 15th century, a man uses this phrase. Now, forward in the 21st century, another man, completely seemingly unconnected to him, has the idea to put that flag on these ships, thus identifying the ships with the prophecy. What do you this is not a fair question, but I got to ask you, what do you think happened? How did that happen?
Well, there's two possibilities. One would be that the political advisor of the president, and the president himself, is a great reader of prophecy and is trying to self-fulfill, as one sees often happen with the Vatican in regards to papal prophecies. They do try very hard to fulfill prophecies. In fact, that's a tradition that's in the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition, to politicize prophecy, to try to make things happen. I mean, Jesus was not the only claimant to the line of David that came into Jerusalem on an ass with palm fronds laid before him. That was one of the steps that was put forth by the prophecies that had to be fulfilled. And anybody who's read their New Testament knows that there's a number of phrases where Jesus did this to fulfill prophecy, Jesus did that. And that was so that is one kind of line. Now, my intuition says that Karl Rove and the president and are not very good reads of prophecy or scholars of it. So the other possibility is you have a man who's using a facility of the human mind that is hardly known or tapped or understood to look way off in the distant future and see a vision of a flag of a true serpent on ships going through the Straits of Carmania, which is the Persian Gulf, which he called the great fleet will plunge and sink in the Arabian Gulf. Now, you got to understand that in Nostradamus' day, they never called it the Persian Gulf. In fact, most Arabs even today don't call the Persian Gulf the Persian Gulf. They call it the Arabian Gulf. It's just the Western geographers who call it that. So here he is describing a flag. Often Nostradamus' prophecies are visual and audio in nature. Sometimes he even smells the future. And it's an image. It's a unique serpent flag. They will invade, he says, at a time when they're allied or involved with Byzantium, which is the ancient name for Turkey. One of our closest American allies in the Middle Eastern region is Turkey. He also talks in the same prophecy about Egypt being involved, and that nearly 1 million men from Persia would be moving westward. Now, the Al-Quds, which is a military within the military of Iran, kind of the Iranian SS, if you will, or the Islamic Revolution. They put the guns down to guard the Sharia law as it's interpreted by the Grand Council of High Council of Ayatollahs, headed by Supreme Ayatollah Khamenei, who's really the leader of Iran. Ahmadinejad is just a mouthpiece for the regime. There are, in both cases, in the Al-Quds guards, if you factor in their own police force and paramilitary forces that guard their own people and tyrannize their own people, there are very nearly 1 million men in that force. The Iranian regular army, if you look at its Army, Navy, and Air Force, is somewhere around 700,000 men. It's nearly 1 million men. The the thing that's important with this prophecy, which I've been talking about since 1986 when I wrote my first book, that there seems to be a key to the radicalization of Islam and the potential for Armageddon, I always felt was coming from the Ayatollahs of Iran. That it would fulfill, as I later found out, Muhammad's famous prophecy about a great jihad of the black flag that would come out of Khorasan, which is the eastern greater Iran, by the way, which includes Afghanistan. In fact, that's the central point of Khorasan. And they would come, and they would wear black turbans, and they would have black flags. The Taliban wear black turbans. They're signifying dress code. And the flags of Muhammad and the flag of Al-Qaeda is black. Muhammad's flag is jet black. Al-Qaeda's flag in Afghanistan has the "There's no God but God" inscription in white. Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, better known in the West as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, has the same flag with gold inscription. At the very least, we have people in the radical Islamic circles who believe that they are the people Muhammad is talking about, who would throw the tyranny of crusaders off the Ummah, or the Ummah, that is, the community of believers of Islam across the world. So people in the Islamic world are very excited and debating a number of their prophecies, which seem to be coming true.
Yes.
We have here,
John, we're going to talk about those prophecies in great detail in just a few minutes. How do the prophecies that are popular in the Mideast dovetail with those of Nostradamus? And what exactly is the media now saying about Iran? We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. I'm talking to John Hogue, HogueProphecy.com. Don't miss his ebook about Iran. It is really dynamic. Plus, he has a free newsletter. So keep up with the work of John Hogue on Hogue Prophecy. It's .com. Yeah, that's right. Nostradamus, The War with Iran is his ebook. Whitley Strieber said of this book after reading it, far more informative and fact-based than you would ever get from the mainstream media. You will learn more about Iran and the U.S. military's deployments in the region than you thought possible. It is very important stuff. This is what you need to know as we move into a really uncertain future. John, before we left the air, we were beginning to talk about the relationship between some of the prophecies that are popular in the Mideast and the Nostradamus prophecy. And could you expand on this just a little bit?
Yes, one of the key chilling prophecies in Nostradamus, we'll start first with him and see how it unites with the famous sayings from the Hadith, the conversations and observations of Muhammad, which are not part of the Quran. It's a much larger piece of just Muhammad outside of the Quran, trying to kind of interpret it to describe the daily life of a believer in the Ummah, the community of believers, which at this current rate is of population is 1/6 of the human race, about 1 billion people. In it, Nostradamus often uses the term black to describe what happens when a great crusader army, a Christian crusader army, occupies Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the classical name, which Nostradamus always used classical names, for modern-day Iran. And he talked about that a very fast attack up the river, and then but the battle would go towards the enemy, meaning those against the Crusaders, and their law would hold. Now, the use of law in this can be interpreted to mean the Sharia law, the law of how Muslims believe and practice their religion in the world, their code of ethics. And it's implying that the Crusader army will be defeated. Now, I've been saying this since the year 2000, before the Crusader army even went there because of certain inferences in Nostradamus and intuitions that said that if President Bush had been made president during the dispute of Florida, that within sometime around the middle of his first term, he would get us into a new Vietnamese-style quagmire, only this time overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And that would be the triggering point to a rise of the Ayatollahs, the rise of those dressed in black, the black ones that Nostradamus often talks about in his prophecies. It is the rise of a black one that he says that his hand empowered through the bloody alus. Now, alus is an anagram for le, abbreviated for the, ou, sa in French. That means, to reinterpret that prophecy, saying his power finally emboldened through the bloody USA, and basically describes the overthrow of an Arab dictator. It describes the rise of this angry black one. Now, I have been seeing in my vision since the late 80s a young man built like a linebacker, real meaty, big block of a man who would be the black one, the Ayatollah that this prophecy is talking about. So I was quite struck by the emergence of Muqtada al-Sadr, who runs the Jesh al-Mahdi, the army, the militia of the al-Mahdi, which, by the way, is a militia that is primed and trained specifically to fulfill Muhammad's prophecy about the Black Flag Crusade from Khorasan, from Afghanistan and eastern Persia. This is the army. Al-Mahdi is the name of the 12th Imam, that is the 12th direct genetic descendant of Muhammad, which has been a dispute since the beginning of the Islamic religion between the Sunnah, the people of the mainstream way, and the Shia, which is an abbreviation in Arabic for those who follow the descendants of the direct descendants of Muhammad. They believe that gives that, and it's all a struggle over who is going to be the head of the great community of Islam, the Caliph. And this struggle has led to civil wars, the murder of many, assassinations of many caliphs, the martyrdom, if you will, as the Shia see, of Al-Hassan, the son of anyway, to make a long story short, it's quite complex, and I go into it at great length in the book, in the chapter, The Rise of the Ayatollahs. It goes through the whole history of how they have risen to this point where, through better or worse, through the actions of a crusader army getting bogged down in Mesopotamia, Iraq, we now have the very thing that back in 1986 I warned would happen, a spread of radical Islam out of Iran across westward with the intended desire to take back Jerusalem. Al-Quds, which is the name of the Iranian Republican Revolutionary Guard, the special forces and the SS, if you will, of this extreme Islamic interpretation of a government, Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran, means Jerusalem in Arabic. That's the term, Al-Quds. So wow. They are the Jerusalem Brigade. They are aiding, arming, and abetting the militias that are expected to be guided by the reemergence of the 12th descendant or Caliph in the Shia idea of Islam, of Muhammad, who, and this is why it's so important to understand why things blew up in the Civil War, literally, after the Golden Mosque of Samarra was blown up by the Sunnis, by the Al-Qaeda extremists. This place is where the 12th Imam purportedly disappeared from the earth and is to reappear. So it's almost like if Christians and Jews had a specific place where they expected their Messiah to appear. They would build, of course, a very important temple around it. I mean, it's literally like blowing up the temple on the mount if you're Shia.
Yes.
That they blew up Samarra. And it started this huge intersectine, sectarian war.
Let me ask you this question. How can they hope to win without a caliphate? Because, in fact, right now, the battle between the Sunnis and the Shia across the whole Islamic world is more intense than it has been in centuries. And in other words, this is a divided house. So as a divided house, let me tell you what I'm getting at. I'm not saying that I don't think they can. What's worrying me is I do think they can. But I don't know why I think that, John. I just sense that there is something about Iran, that they're actually trying to tempt us into attacking them, and because they have something that we don't know about. How do you respond to that?
Oh well, this is why I felt such an urgency to get that book out and before these actions take place, because what is underpinning all of this potential collision between three powers, Iran, Israel, and America, over Iran and attacking Iran, is all based on a messianic, feverish misinterpretation of the scriptures of three major Western religions, who think they see indications that their Messiah, case of the Shia, the Mahdi, the return of the 12th Imam, who reappears. In the case, I can tell you from my Kabbalistic sources in Jerusalem, there is a fever-pitch interest, and even declarations are being made that the appearance of Emmanuel, the true Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, is upon them. It's about to happen. You have the White House, the current government, which is absolutely filled with supernumeraries and assistants that come from some of the most extreme evangelical Christian universities who absolutely believe in the literal interpretation of apocalyptic literature. For instance, the universities that Pat Robertson runs.
Do you think that they might be trying to cause Armageddon, to induce it?
As I said earlier, the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions of prophecy have something unique that most other traditions don't have. They politicize openly, in Scripture as well as in reality. There's a dimension that politicizes a prophecy. That is, they see that God is telling them to openly fulfill the steps to make the last step happen. Whereas, native prophets allow things to happen. The Eastern prophets are more laissez-faire about it. Just, well, if it's supposed to happen, it'll happen. There's a very much a participation of the people of the time with their prophecies to do things that will almost encourage God to make it happen. And when you have three religions that have that construct in their view of their end-time prophecies, you have then three religions who currently are the background noise of three leaders who believe in their versions of apocalyptic prophecy, who understand that only if things get very bad are their version going to be tested and proven in the fires of the final battle. You have in the book I show, we all in the West have heard the insanities of Ahmadinejad, a head of state, making statements, brazen statements about the erasure of Israel that even Adolf Hitler in his worst public statements never made about even the Jews or the Russians in World War II.
It's really, really obscene. It's a moral obscenity, what he's been saying. It's true. But
it's not the whole of it. And this is the great crime of our mainstream news.
Oh, John, another great crime is about to be perpetrated. We have to take a break. We'll find out about an even greater crime in just a moment. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back with John Hogue talking about Iran prophecy and the immediate future. Looking at a time when Fox News has just been reporting that Iran may be under attack by the United States in 8 to 10 months. A report picked up by the Jerusalem Post, the stated reason being that the refusal of Germany to impose further sanctions on Iran has pushed the U.S. across a line. And now Army officials are trying to convince Condoleezza Rice to abandon once and for all the diplomatic route and to move on this after the candidates for both parties are nominated, but before the next election. Terrifying stuff, and it feels like something that could go out of hand. John, let's continue talking. John's website, HogueProphecy.com. You can actually get the book we're talking about right now by going to HogueProphecy.com and simply downloading the ebook. How much is it, John?
It's $12 or $12.15.
$12 and change. And how do you pay for it?
Well, you can use PayPal. I have some you can go in the shopping cart and click on it. It gives you instructions on how to download it. And, I figure if, as a prophecy scholar, if what I have to say has any merit, I should be making the next step in media dissertation. So I've moved into the world of photonic books, as I call it.
Right.
I gather my electrons and send to you books made of light and shadow rather than destroying trees. As also my bit in helping the earth. So I branched out into that, and I have 2 books out. The Last Pope Revisited looked at the St. Malachi prophecies after the crowning of the current pope, and then this book, which I released in June 10th. And even though it's been released in June 10th and written in April and May, more and more of the events are catching up with it. And it's one of the reasons why I rushed so rapidly and did something I've never done in the 12 books that I've written. I produced that book in 8 weeks.
Yes, I know. I was privy to this, folks, because, of course, John was telling me about what he was doing as he was doing it, and also I had the privilege of reading the book, which is exactly as current right now as it was then, because this is John Hogue. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but we're having just about the finest discussion, in-depth discussion about Iran that I've ever heard anywhere. I think John is extremely well informed, and his information is enhanced and dimensionalized by his knowledge of prophecy. And this is something that you will never see or hear on Fox News, on CNN, because they disdain the idea. They laugh at the idea of prophecy because they're ignorant and simple people. They're not richly endowed minds like we're dealing with John Hogue right now. Not at all. So if you want to be at the cutting edge, you're at it right now. And let's go on as to where we are, and we've touched a couple of times on this issue of there being something in the prophecies that is very ominous, that looks a lot more ominous. For example, the description of what would happen is that the United States would cut off gas supplies to Iran, which it can do quite easily, in order to infuriate the Iranian people and make them rise up against their government. And the government is extremely unpopular in Iran. It's not popular at all. The only thing it gets in terms of popularity is when the United States becomes bellicose, and then people begin to feel their nationalistic spirit rising. But normally, the average Iranian is not in favor of this government. They're just trapped by it. So that's one thing we would do. The other thing we would be bombing the nuclear sites and setting them back in their nuclear program X amount of time. And if we can destabilize the centrifuges, the 3,000 centrifuges that they're using to make highly enriched uranium, we'd set it back a long time. But whether or not we can do that remains to be seen. But John, what's missing in this picture? Why are the prophecies so ominous if this looks like such a piece of cake?
what's missing is as you were asking earlier, how could the Ummah, the community of 1 billion Islamics, unite when there's basically what I'm going to write about in Hope Prophecy Bulletins in the near future is a cycle that happens, it seems, in Western religions that about the time when Christianity was as old as Islam is today, that is when they had their great schismatic religious civil war, the 30 Years' War. And that what we're about to see, or we're already engaged in, is Islam's evolution in the same timeline of the life cycle of a religion, is their version of the 30 Years' War. The last one was fought between Protestants and Catholics in Central Europe. It killed half the population of Central Europe over 30 years, one of the most devastating periods of warfare in history, and that Islam is now threatened with a similar problem, as it's beset, and one might say rightfully so, the way Muhammad is expressing it in his famous prophecy from the Hadith. In that prophecy, by the way, he said that there would come a time when the multitudes of believers. Remember, this is in 7th century when he's making this conversation, when there were only a few thousand followers. And he said, when they're as numerous as the foam in the sea, which, if you're living in a world that hasn't seen more than 300-400 million people tops in the entire planet, the concept of 1 billion adherents would be as if, metaphorically, the foam on the sea. But he talked about how at that time they would have tremendous wealth, but it would be denied them by Western Crusader usurpers, and that they would also be too attached to life and fear martyrdom and death, and that the community of Islamics would even help the Westerners, the Crusaders, and when they did this, they would not be given credit for it. And he talks about how they would be taken, a delegation would be taken to a place of forests and snow-capped mountains, and the leaders of the Christian leaders would then deny their part in accomplishing some great war, and then they would be colonized. And it sounds to me like he's describing the delegations of Arab leaders who fought with Lawrence of Arabia with the idea that by overthrowing the Ottoman Empire, they would achieve independence, and the sheikdoms could then unite. Well, what of course happened is that they achieved colonialism. In fact, the creation of Iraq, the creation that Winston Churchill said was his greatest mistake in his career, came out of the Versailles Treaty, and describing the Alps, describing Europe, where the leaders of the Islamic Ummah went and were basically shined on and turned into colonial subjects. These signs of the issue, I'm not trying to defend the barbarism of another side, but it has always been my contention from just studying prophecy and studying the nature of why it keeps repeating itself and why we don't seem to learn from our foreseen future histories, is that both sides seem to forever misjudge or project their judgments and ignorance on the other side. I mean, Hannibal was one of the great conquerors of past military history, always learned about his enemy before he fought them. If he was fighting a new Roman general in the Punic Wars, he got his spies to find out everything about their strengths and weaknesses. Because if you're going to fight in a war with someone who you perceive as your enemy, if you are disparaging them, if you disrespect your enemy, again and again, you will be setting yourself up to lose. And the level in which the commander-in-chief of the current administration has misjudged and ignored this lesson is showing its historic fruits again. The situation is that Muhammad saw in this prophecy that at a certain time, a third of the community of believers would follow the West and lose their souls. A third would be killed by the West. the Western Christian collision in this new jihad, and a third would actually be martyrs, that is, and they would go directly to heaven. A third would succeed in achieving the caliphate, and a third would be lost to sin and hell by serving the Crusaders. You know, the whole concept of both sides of these extreme Islamic views, the Shias of Muqtada al-Sadr and the Wahhabis who populate Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden's group, both look at their enemy with the same label, Crusaders, the same label that Muhammad used, and it's really quite a remarkable prophecy and rather chilling, because it seems that Muhammad, his prophecy is being fulfilled by the most extreme elements of the Islamic Ummah. But at the same time, I have Kabbalists who are also sexing up, if you will, the political aspirations of the Knesset and the Prime Minister and the War Ministers, that this is now the time. This is the time to strike. You have the same, every Sunday, our president sits with some of the most staunch and radical evangelical Christian apocalyptists for breakfast. And you can imagine what they're talking about. And
we're going to find out more about what they're talking about in just a couple of minutes. We'll be right back. We're talking to John Hogue about Iran, and when we left the air, we were just beginning to talk about what might be going in the president's mind from the mouths of apocalyptics who have his ear. And could it be that the White House would like to induce Armageddon in order to cause the rapture to take place? Are they that crazy? Gosh, John, it scares me. Tell us more.
Well, one has to look, and I do very carefully throughout the book, try to find some objective references that might support or refute that very question. Do we have a president in his heart of hearts, and is he supported by insulated worldview that supports it, kind of a Führerbunker mentality that paints the world in an isolated and imaginary way? And when you've got a president who is on record saying that he talks and listens to a higher father, when he has been when it's been documented and witnessed by Haaretz and other Israeli newspapers, where he feels that he's more able to openly speak his mind on religion, that he told the current president of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, when they met a month or so after the invasion of Iraq at Sharm el-Sheikh, to try to piece together and patch up the roadmap to peace between Palestinians and Israelis, he basically had this heated conversation with him where he said, God told me to strike down Saddam Hussein, and I did it. God told me to do this and that, and I'm here to help you if you would let me. And it's just like he's like saying, God, CIA, Tenet's findings, the NSA, the intelligence gatherers, the spies, the people that we need to find solid, actionable intelligence, didn't tell him to invade Iraq. God told him to invade Iraq. And that's where the great decider decided, because this is the chilling reality that we have to face. Now, God told the president of Iran to openly talk about the erasure of Israel off the map of history. God is telling the president of Iran, and he's mentioning it in his speeches, that the Mahdi is about to reappear. And that's why these times are getting so to the edge. You go over into Shia Iraq, and if the American press would only just try to sometimes disseminate the many harangues and speeches of Muqtada al-Sadr, he is constantly talking about the coming of the Mahdi. He is beating a feverish pitch about it. all have to do is look at the statements that were made openly on BBC's documentary about would Israel attack Iran that was done last year. And I have all the quotes in my book, Nostradamus, The War with Iran, which shows Ehud Olmert and many of the top leaders of the Israeli Knesset fomenting the same insanity that Ahmadinejad in Iran has been fomenting. But you don't hear about that in the mainstream press. What you also don't hear is that there are a number of things going on right now that are ramping up for war. You know, the fact that this famous story about just last week, there was a major attack by Israel into Syria, probably to bomb a weapons stash or convoy of that was shipping probably rockets into Hezbollah from.
Yes.
And in fact, the area where it struck, there is a prophecy about it. I was just looking at it today as I was reviewing the book, and I described in the book the area where if a Syrian Israeli part of this war was triggered, it would be through this supply line. This very same supply line may have been described in classical language by Nostradamus in his geographical prophecy about a blow that would bring in Syria. And so when I look at it again, given what happened last week, that was an open provocation. Israel hasn't bombed a Syrian target since 2003. And you have also 350...
When John says last week, folks, this is going to be about 2 weeks ago when you hear this program. But go ahead, John.
Yeah. The British Hussar Regiment, 350 soldiers that moved out of the palace in Basra, are being repositioned on the border with Iran. There was at one time as many as 10,000 U.S. soldiers doing a drill or a rehearsal on the Iraqi side of the southern border with Iran. There is going to be an attempt soon to cut off all traffic of weapons through the main conduits of Abadan in Khorramshahr in the Iranian side over the Shah al-Arab into the approaches to Basra, which is where most of the heavy weaponry, the new missiles that the Iranians are giving the Shias to launch on American bases that are something like 400-millimeter missiles. And you see both sides itching to fulfill their prophecy, trying to create an incident. Israel tried to create an incident with Syria.
And Syria was unresponsive. And what does that tell us? It tells us that somebody's trying to avoid this because they don't think they can win.
Yeah, and Syria certainly is the the odd man out in this because, there would be directly hit by Israel, and Iran's a harder target to hit. Anyone who's flown over the country, as I have on my many trips back and forth to India, one can marvel at how mountainous. If you think about California, Sierra Nevada, imagine a dozen Sierra Nevadas rolling one after the other like the Appalachian foothills outside of Washington, D.C., only these are like 12,000-foot mountain ranges, and with deep valleys and mountainous terrain. And we know how difficult it is to attack from the air and get all your targets because of the Kosovo incident.
Right.
NATO tried this with Serbia over the Albanian question.
Well, the West has had a long history of hostility with Persia, of course, beginning with the Greeks and the eventual defeat of the Persian King Darius at the Battle of Salamis, then extending into the Roman Empire, where there was a 300-year kind of armed face-off between Parthia, which had been Persia, and the Roman Empire, and the Romans could never conquer them, and it was, of course, again, because of terrain. The only reason the Greeks succeeded was that the Persians came out into Greece, they invaded, and that turned out to be a grave mistake. And so now here we are, and this country which has remained ferociously independent all of this time. Unlike other parts of the Middle East, it's never been colonized by anybody. The biggest attempt to colonize it was the Shah, who was a client of the United States, and he lasted only a few 20, 30 years, and then he was gone. So now we have Iran almost a rogue state. And do you believe, I'm very well aware of the fact that the Syrians play a kind of a game. In other words, they'll give Hezbollah as much as they can, but then when Israel lashes out at them, they back off. Iran, what happens? What does Iran do if we attack?
Well, first off, one of the huge strategic errors of perception that are being made, and I'm even getting reports from people, naval officers on those very same carriers that are on station in the Persian Gulf, that some of the people that talk down to them from the government, our government, don't even know the fact that Iranians aren't Arabs, and that there is an entire different race, it's an entirely different culture, and to add to your overview historically about people who tried to conquer Iran or Persia, the only time the Persian Empire fell was to Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great did the one thing that the Romans didn't do and that the Greeks didn't do. He assimilated Hellenistic culture with Persian culture. And it was one of the reasons why, up until his death, and later, as his empire broke up amongst his generals, the Seleucid Empire and the other empires survived because they assimilated. What I'm saying, my point being, is they listened to their enemy, and that helped them not be their enemy anymore. They shared. They were into intercultural experience. Whenever the Aryan Persians have been faced off by a group that is haughty and it does not respect or even listen to their culture or their complaints, they never win. Now the Iranians are facing, and I look at these scenarios in the book. I mean, one of the scenarios I look at is the Iranians counterattack with everything they have. And what would that happen with our deep-water Navy stuck in the little pond called the Persian Gulf? And I also look at what would happen if they went and attacked Israel just to bring Israel in the war. But I also look at what might happen if America politically, the American administration, can't get into the war, and so Plan B is Israel strikes Iran, and that forces them to defend Israel.
Well, I think this.
But there's a third.
Go ahead, please.
There's a third and final scenario, which I look at in the Black Flags of Our Martyrs chapter 8 of Iran, Nostradamus, the War with Iran, is what if the Iranians do nothing, and that we hit 1,200 targets, we blow up their reactors, and except for doing what any country would do, defend the 12 miles of sea in front of their coast or shoot at anything that's in their airspace, what if they took the blow? Even then, it would become the Pearl Harbor event for the Islamic world. It's what might transcend. Here's I finally answering a question about what could make the caliphate happen, what could stop a civil war between Shia and Sunni, is the very hubris of an attack. And if the Iranians did nothing in response, didn't hit Israel, didn't do anything, the Islamic world would rise up against Israel and America in this, and then you might still have a popular uprising throughout the Islamic world that would overthrow Western-friendly governments like Mubarak in Egypt, even the Turkish government, even the government that was trying to put up. Yes, and then you have the front. If Iran were to respond, they would respond on the streets of Baghdad with 60,000 martyrs. The Ahmadinejad has boasted, at least, that if Iran was bombed by America, they would unleash an army of 60,000 suicide bombers. Probably many of them are already infiltrated into Iraq. The other thing that could happen is if the Shia rebelled and rose up against the occupation, all the lines of communication of our 170,000 soldiers, and probably add another 100,000 civilian contractors and mercenaries, would the roads out or the roads of communication and supply would be blocked off by Iranian weapons, Iranian-shaped charged explosions, and basically that army would have its lines of communication cut and supply and would force America out of Iraq. They'd have to fight their way to Kuwait. And you could see the response, rather than the response they're hoping will happen, that Iran will just crumble or do absolutely nothing. They may do nothing to respond to Israel or to our fleets, but they may actually make it untenable for us in Iraq.
John Hogue, I want to thank you very much for an incredibly provocative and intelligent look at the explosive situation in the Middle East through the eyes of a prophet. Don't miss John's website, HogueProphecy.com. For $12, using a credit card or PayPal, you can download the book we've been talking about immediately, Iran and Nostradamus. So don't miss it. John Hogue, thank you for being with us. Next up on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe. Linda Moulton Howe is back this week with what she has promised are going to be some astonishing revelations about our solar system involving the use of remote viewing as she continues with her exploration of Jim Marrs in his book, Spies. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Yes, in Jim Marrs' new book, Spies, on pages 256 to 257, he writes about the fascinating United States Army's remote viewing Enigma files. Quote, late in 1988, Mel Riley, a remote viewer, was working on projects for the U.S. Army. He recalled that their superiors brought them a satellite photograph to study. The photograph showed simply a glowing object, but in remote viewing sessions, the object had humanoid people in it, and the craft was hovering above a nuclear storage facility. The remote viewer impression was that these visitors were bean counting, literally taking an inventory of the number of armed warheads at the military depot. When the Spies remote viewed and tracked these objects back to their point of origin, the remote viewers found the objects came from subsurface locations, that means underground, on our moon, on Mars, and that they would come back to rest in subsurface locations on Earth, unquote. I asked Jim Marrs to explain more details about what the remote viewers found about these non-human underground bases on Earth seen by remote viewers working for our government.
One of the best and earliest remote viewers was a former police detective named Pat Price, who just by happenstance they stumbled across and brought him into the testing that was being done at SRI, and he proved to be just a tremendous remote viewer. Well, Pat Price would not only do what they asked him to do, but he would take it upon himself to go look at things, and one day he showed up with a report he had written up about these 4 alien bases that he had seen on the Earth. One of them is in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. The other is in Zimbabwe in Africa. Another one is located under Mount Hayes in Alaska. And the 4th base was under Mount Zeal in Australia. As I recall, the one in the Pyrenees is a transportation hub. That's where they kind of come and go for off-planet
Maintenance and repair base.
Yeah, that's the one in Zimbabwe in Africa. That's where they go for maintenance and repair. The one under Mount Hayes in Alaska is for monitoring the Earth, looking at weather patterns, pollution patterns, finding out what's happening with the Earth. And the one in Australia apparently is a rest and recreation area. That's where they all kind of mingle and kind of hang out. Apparently they had come across several different species, almost all of them, if they would talk about ETs, would talk about the diminutive grays. I think the lizards were also mentioned. I think they see all of these on the 4 bases the transportation center of the pyramids seems to be primarily under control of the little grays, but they see them working with each other at certain other bases.
You have interviewed Lynn Buchanan and Mr. McMonigal and Morehouse and Mel Riley, who have been very good at remote viewing. Has anybody talked to you privately about seeing specific details of non-humans?
Oh, yes. At one point, when they were discussing amongst themselves these occurrences of remote viewing UFOs, and they were discussing, well, where they come from, what are they all about, they decided, well, why don't, instead of talking about these random sightings that we're seeing, why don't we just track it right back to the source, figure out, where the control point is. They actually tasked Mel Riley to go take a look at what they could only describe as Intergalactic Federation headquarters, okay? And he ended up with a very, very bizarre experience. He ended up in a mountainous area with a very large plateau and a huge lake that he equated to something similar to Lake Titicaca, and that there was a huge ziggurat there, or pyramid, with a sloping ramp, which he ascended. And inside the pyramid was a huge room with a dais in the center of it, and that they were hooded figures standing around there, and that the prominent emotion he felt was happiness and joy at almost a homecoming. It was like he had been there before, and he went over and lay on the dais while a beam of light came down and enshrouded him. And he just said he had a complete feeling of well-being and being home, to the point to where he really didn't want to come back, but they ended the session and he came back to his 3D material existence.
But what did he see in terms of physical features of the hooded entities?
I don't believe he ever got any clear picture of who these people were. Now, keep in mind, the remote viewers, several of them, have told me that not only have they seen various extraterrestrials of various visage, as you pointed out, the grays, you've got the reptilians, you've got the tall blonde Nordics, but they have also seen beings of energy and light, which they call transcendentals. So there is just a whole wide spectrum of life out there, and some of it is not even on the material plane of existence as we are.
But did Mel Riley come away with any sense of the agenda of these hooded figures, that the whole reason for the remote viewing was to go back to the source controlling the non-human interaction with the Earth?
Right. I think that this gets past the three-dimensional material plane and shows us that there are other planes of existence, and it gets into what I guess I could only call the spiritual, and that we are all beings of energy, and that as such we're all connected, and that when we come and are relegated to this 3D material plane of existence, we're all here kind of like going to kindergarten. We're here to learn some lessons, to learn how to get along in the material world, perhaps just to experience the material world, and that at some point we will again graduate and we will again become part of the energy whole of the universe, which is omniscient and omnipresent and pretty well fits the definition of God. They've had all kinds of strange and exotic experiences. That's why I say in my book, Sci-Fi, that if you get into this, your life will never be the same, because you will be so much expanded in consciousness. Mel Riley, for example, I'll never forget, told me, he said they really had problems with the Sci-Fi unit because, you know, they were tasked to go look at Russian submarines, and as Mel Riley said, he said, when you go out and look throughout the universe, you know, who wants to go look at a Russian submarine?
Well, whatever the agenda of the non-humans, I was very interested in the fact that the remote viewers, in some cases, extending themselves into things like what's happening to the ozone,
Right.
have picked up what they would describe as futures of this planet, in which there is a collapse of the ozone that is serious between 2005 and 2012, leading to a very different surface life on the Earth. Could you talk about that in some detail?
Right. Some of the military-trained remote viewers were tasked to look into the future and find out what the future looked like, and what they saw were people living underground and people living in domed cities to protect themselves from a harsher environment, apparently due to increased solar activity and a continuing depletion of the ozone layer. Interestingly enough, they also saw in this grim future the fact that humans were working in conjunction with extraterrestrials. And they saw the sky was striated and was multi-hued. In other words, like there were chemicals in the air. And one of the things that made a very definite impression on me was that the sci-fi said when they look backwards in time, everything's pretty fixed and everything's pretty solid. It's already happened. There it is. But when they look into the future, the farther into the future they try to look, the more blurry things become. And this is pretty interesting to me because this would seem to me to indicate that the future is not etched in stone and that the future is in a state of flux, and therefore we still have the opportunity to change our future by changing our actions in the present.
It does not make sense that our government would not still have professional remote viewers working and in operation right now.
Absolutely. Let me tell you how this works. Right now, the government officially would tell you that they have no formal remote viewing group or organization within the government. And technically, that's probably true. But what they have done is, number one, they have taken individual remote viewers and embedded them within various groups and organizations. For example, I understand they have a remote viewer in the Navy SEALs. They have at least one remote viewer in the Army Rangers. And this only makes sense because what military commander would not want somebody near at hand who might at least possibly give him some indication on what's over the next hill? I also understand that there are remote viewers embedded in various other government organizations, and they also are contracting out to former sci-spies, many of whom are now teaching and have a cadre of students on hand, and they get a contract to go work a session, and then they get the raw data from their viewers, and then they feed the data back to their government sources. And in this way, the government has plausible deniability.
And I wondered if you could now explain what seems to me one of the most important parts of the entire history of sci-spies in your book, that Ingo Swann went out to Jupiter before we had been there with spacecraft. Could you summarize what he had seen in remote viewing, how far before our spacecraft were there?
Right. Well, in the early 70s, Ingo Swann remote viewed the planet Jupiter, and he wrote down, and it was filed and certified, that he said Jupiter has a small ring around it, and that Jupiter has a weak but nevertheless present magnetic field, that there are cloud banks, and under the cloud banks you could see large craggy mountains. And, of course, at that time, nobody had gotten a good look at Jupiter, and nobody knew any of that, so it was just a great big from the science community. But almost 10 years later, when Voyager space probes went out there and began to transmit back data from Jupiter, it was reported in reliable scientific publications that they found it had a small ring around it. It had a present magnetic field. They could detect cloud banks and mountains under the clouds. So it took almost 10 years, but here came the feedback to show that Ingo Swann's remote viewing of Jupiter had been dead on. Another thing, the most astounding feedback that I mentioned, and it's there detailed in sci-spies, is that when the Mars Observer was lost, I immediately picked up the phone and called some of the remote viewers that I'd been dealing with, and I said, hey, what happened to the Mars Observer? Now, the Mars Observer had just gone into orbit around Mars, and they had high hopes that it was going to photograph and look closely at almost the entire surface of the planet. And then all of a sudden, it's just like They lost contact and it went away. I said, well, what happened? And they said, well, right off, they said the same thing that happened to the Phobos 2. Well, the Phobos 2, named of course, for one of Mars's moon, was sent by the Soviets in the late 80s, and it, too, was lost as it went into orbit around Mars. And they had already checked that out, and what the remote viewers saw was that a circular object rose from the surface of Mars, came out to meet the Phobos 2, scanned it with some sort of electromagnetic energy, a beam, if you will. Now, none of this was hostile activity. It was described to me kind of like the tugboat coming out to greet the Queen Mary. But once it scanned the Phobos 2, it realized it wasn't part of its system, so the object turned around and went back to the surface of Mars. But in scanning the spacecraft, it scrambled the onboard computer, and controllers lost control over it, and eventually the spacecraft burned up in the atmosphere as it crashed. So there was a heck of a story. But then in the early 90s, a Soviet cosmonaut was visiting in the United States, and in a news conference in San Francisco, she held up one of the last photographs taken from the Phobos 2, and it showed a circular object approaching the craft. Again, amazing feedback for something the sci-spies had seen.
But, Jim, wouldn't that imply that there is now current intelligence on Mars, underground or someplace, that is releasing probes?
Absolutely. And this leads further credence to the argument that, beginning with the face on Mars, the Cydonia region, that NASA has gone to extreme lengths to cover up this fact and to hide away and to alter photographs and to alter documents and everything else. The idea that they are keeping secrets about UFOs and about activity on Mars and perhaps the moon, that's been a long-standing narrative within the UFO research community, and this only tends to confirm that.
How have we managed, then, to get the mock camera and the spacecraft that are going around Mars currently in air, as well as Spirit and Opportunity rovers on the surface of Mars?
Well, could be that whoever's on Mars, now they know that we're sending things there, so maybe they dug deeper underground, or they don't come out as much, or whatever. Then, of course, again, we're back to the allegation that some of this information that they are getting is being sequestered and censored and kept from the public.
If Ingo Swann was able 10 years before we had a spacecraft to get to Jupiter and do a reality check, and it matches what he had remote viewed 10 years before, isn't that alone fact enough that remote viewing works so well that we should be using it generally?
Exactly. But again, the people in charge, don't want remote viewing used generally, because then we might see through all the lies and deceit that our modern society is built upon, and it could cause harm to the bottom corporate line. And as a result, I think there's been a concerted effort not only to denigrate remote viewing, but to actually sow dissension and keep the remote viewers themselves squabbling with each other and arguing over protocols and technology, so that the public does not get a clear picture. What if the President of the United States was to come on television and tell us there are weapons of mass destruction in this country and we have to go bomb this country to save ourselves and to defend our national security, and then out here you had groups of remote viewers who'd been practicing and were pretty good, and they'd sit down, remote view, and then they'd stand up and say, no, there's nothing there, folks. Obviously, they can't have that.
While I was interviewing Jim Marrs, I questioned whether the Voyager and Galileo probes had really confirmed even a hard core to Jupiter that might have mountains. On September 13th, 2007, I called astronomer and Jupiter expert Professor William Hubbard at Arizona State University in Tucson, and he confirmed that Jupiter does have a thick ring of silicate dust that comes from its interior moons and circles Jupiter, that Jupiter does have a magnetic field, that Jupiter has many, many layers of cloud banks in its thick atmosphere, each made from different chemicals. The highest cloud layers are made up from the lightest chemicals, and the denser chemicals make up the lower cloud banks, going layer by layer by layer through Jupiter. And to my surprise, I learned that Professor Hubbard and others have a paper ready to submit to a major science journal very soon for publication, yet in 2007, that will focus on a growing astronomical controversy. Does Jupiter have a solid core, and if so, how large is it? Professor Hubbard said that their new paper will feature computer models and data that indicate a likelihood that Jupiter does have a solid core that could be as large as 10 to 20 Earth masses. Would that core have mountains? Professor Hubbard said that currently there is no scientific instrument that could determine the physical nature of the suspected Jupiter core. But Whitley, there might be no hard evidence that Jupiter has some mountains, yet we could be headed towards scientific consensus that Jupiter does have a solid core, and that means, if that is confirmed, that Ingo Swann's remote viewing more than 30 years ago was nearly 100% correct.
Well, Linda, that is absolutely fascinating. And, I've had a long history of connection with the remote viewing community in various different ways. And I was always quite interested to learn what might have been going on behind the scenes. I was particularly interested in the material about the bases, the different alien bases, especially because, there's a part of Australia near Pine Gap out in central Western Australia where there's a highway called Alien Alley, or the UFO Highway, like similar to the one near Area 51, because there's just so much of that activity in that immediate area. And, you have to wonder, now I don't know anything about the mountain in Alaska at all, or the place in Africa, but you do have to wonder when when there's corroboration like that on the ground, exactly what might be going on.
Yes, and the Pyrenees are probably as famous as any place in Europe that I know, where there are multiple sightings over now at least half a century. So that means the Pyrenees, and I would agree that this Mount Zeit and I'm going to show maps of each of these locations at my earthfiles.com news report. I would say that if you went to Africa and you said, where have there been more reports of things like perhaps even the human abduction syndrome, Zimbabwe would definitely be on that list, just from historic stories. So right now, in realizing that remote viewing and remote viewers who were tasked by the CIA and the United States Army and worked in the beginning, Ingo Swann was working at Stanford Research Institute, that these are people who were so accurate that the government kept coming back with more and more and more tests, and that Ingo Swann's work on Jupiter alone should say to us, there is an ability that the human mind has to access what might be considered electromagnetic grids, not only on the Earth, but throughout the solar system and the universe, and that this is not mythology. This is something that could be perhaps learned by everybody, and it might help us to penetrate all of the, we'll call it the lack of truth world around us, and eventually, maybe, as we move, if we survive and get into further decades down the line, maybe many, many people will learn how to do this.
Well, Linda, let's hope so. And certainly, folks, there are any number of good remote viewing courses out there. I've taken Lynn Buchanan's course, and there are many other good courses as well. You can learn how to do this. It's perfectly possible. I was just having breakfast yesterday with a gentleman who took a course in Hawaii and learned to do it very well. And it isn't hard, and I think it's just generally possible. It's something that we can all do. So if you are interested, I would pursue it. And I would frankly look for a course that's reasonably inexpensive that you can hopefully take at home and see what you can do with it. Because as I say, I think not only Lynn Buchanan, but I believe Joe McMonagle and quite a number of others teach it. So
that's right, and I will have a list of all of the remote viewers who are teaching and have websites now. That will be at the website section of earthfiles.com.
Well, great. Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for a terrific report. And folks, don't ever miss a week of Dreamland because you're missing way too much.
Spoken about the importance of Iran, the importance of a return of a Jewish nation into Palestine after a war that lasts 6 days, a 6-day war, and how these two, in combination with this strange riddle of a true serpent as a symbol for the invaders.
A true serpent, did you say?
Yeah, a true serpent, which is...
But I don't want to interrupt your flow, but we're going to need to know what that you believe that means, a true serpent.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say, that it is the key to, like many things with Nostradamus' random codes, it's the key that unlocks a lot of his prophecies to give us an idea of whether they're about our times or near future times. The true serpent is involved with, perhaps the Israelis, with an attack on Persia, the ancient name of Iran. It is an invader that comes through Karmania's coast, which is the Strait of Hormuz. In the prophecies, he calls it Karmania by its old name. And the true serpent has been a riddle for 4 centuries that people have tried to figure out. And I've often stated in my books and radio that when you're close to an event being fulfilled, the riddles suddenly drop and they become quite clear. The true serpent is the U.S. Navy Jack. That is a flag that is 13 stripes, red and white stripes, with a uncoiled rattlesnake on it. And it's basically the original Navy Jack of the United States Navy during the American Revolution. That back on September 11, 2002, on the first year anniversary of the 9/11 disaster, terrorist attack, George W. Bush, the President of the United States, has designated that all Navy ships fly that flag until the end of the war. Invade, he says, at a time when they're allied or involved with Byzantium, which is the ancient name for Turkey. One of our closest American allies in the Middle Eastern region is Turkey. He also talks in the same prophecy about Egypt being involved, and that nearly 1 million men from Persia would be moving westward. Now, the Al-Quds, which is a military within the military of Iran, kind of the Iranian SS, if you will, for the Islamic Revolution. They put the guns down to guard the Sharia law as it's interpreted by the Grand Council of High Council of Ayatollahs, headed by Supreme Ayatollah Khamenei, who's really the leader of Iran. Ahmadinejad is just a mouthpiece for the regime. There are, in both cases, in the Al-Quds guards, if you factor in their own police force and paramilitary forces that guard their own people and tyrannize their own people, there are very nearly 1 million men in that force. The Iranian regular army, if you look at its Army, Navy, and Air Force, is somewhere around 700,000 men. It's nearly 1 million men. The thing that's important with this prophecy, which I've been talking about since 1986 when I wrote my first book, that there seems to be a key to the radicalization of Islam and the potential for Armageddon, I always felt was coming from the Ayatollahs of Iran. That it would fulfill, as I later found out, Muhammad's famous prophecy about a great jihad of the black flag that would come out of Khorasan, which is the eastern greater Iran, by the way, which includes Afghanistan. In fact, that's the central point of Khorasan. And they would come himself as a great reader of prophecy and is trying to self-fulfill as one sees often happen with the Vatican in regards to papal prophecies. They do try very hard to fulfill prophecies. In fact, that's a tradition that's in the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition, to politicize prophecy, to try to make things happen. I mean, Jesus was not the only claimant to the line of David that came into Jerusalem on an ass with palm fronds laid before him. That was one of the steps that was put forth by the prophecies that had to be fulfilled. And anybody who's read their New Testament knows that there's a number of phrases where Jesus did this to fulfill prophecy, Jesus did that. And that was so that is one kind of line. Now, my intuition says that Karl Rove and the president and the are not very good reads of prophecy and or scholars of it. So the other possibility is you have a man who's using a facility of the human mind that is hardly known or tapped or understood to look way off in the distant future and see a vision of a flag of a true serpent on ships going through the Straits of Carmania, which is the Persian Gulf, which he called the great fleet will plunge and sink in the Arabian Gulf. Now, you got to understand that in Nostradamus' day, they never called it the Persian Gulf. In fact, most Arabs even today don't call the Persian Gulf the Persian Gulf. They call it the Arabian Gulf. It's just the Western geographers who call it that. So here he is describing a flag. Often Nostradamus' prophecies are visual and audio in nature. Sometimes he even smells the future. And it's an image. It's a unique serpent flag. They will of terror is upon them. So this is a significant thing because that flag is not flown.
John, just hold on a second. Why would he ask them to fly that particular flag? What was his reasoning?
Well, I think it goes back, as many politicians are advised or think of themselves, the importance of allegory, the importance of symbols. This was a famous, anybody who knows anything about the American Revolution has seen this flag of the serpent, the rattlesnake, and it says, "Don't tread on me" underneath it. This is the first flag that Paul Revere and the American Navy flew. Sort of brings back a symbolism of going back to naval roots and patriotism. And what makes it significant in prophecy is that it's not a flag. If it had been hoisted on the masts of U.S. ships for centuries, it doesn't have a specific time window like it does being hoisted on the Navy ships, all Navy ships, since 2002, to signify a symbolic response of a force that's fighting in a modern war.
Now, there's something absolutely fascinating here, John. There's a mystery. Back in the 15th century, a man uses this phrase. Now, forward in the 21st century, another man, completely seemingly unconnected to him, has the idea to put that flag on these ships, thus identifying the ships with the prophecy. What do you this is not a fair question, but I got to ask you, what do you think happened? How did that happen?
Well, there's two possibilities. One would be that the political advisor of the president and the president himself.
An extremely serious program, and extremely serious because it's about the possible impending attack on Iran and the consequences of such an attack. On September the 13th, the Jerusalem Post reported that the U.S. is to attack Iran in 8 to 10 months. And we need to talk about that, and who better to talk about it than one of the best informed and extraordinary people who ever comes on this program, none other than our resident prophet, John Hogue. Now, what is some dreamy prophet going to come up with? Well, not John Hogue's no dreamy prophet. We hold his feet to the fire every summer, and every January we have him prophesy for the coming year. And it is astonishing stuff. Partly it is because John is a very smart, very well-informed man. Partly because he is also a real prophet. And we know that because we've seen him hit year after year after year. Welcome to the show, John Hogue.
It's great to be back on, Whitley.
Well, it's always exciting to have you on, John. And today we're going to be talking about Iran with John Hogue. And John's website is HogueProphecy.com. There's a great free newsletter just like ours, and you will not get spammed if you join John Hogue's newsletter. It's a private newsletter just like ours. And so do go to HogueProphecy.com, subscribe to his email newsletter, and get involved in prophecy and political and social commentary. Okay, John, there is a new ebook up, I believe, called Nostradamus, The War with Iran. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where we are right now?
Yes, back in the spring, I was compelled to put together a lot of prophetic findings based on the 16th century prophet Nostradamus, and who has long